Okay, so it's 1 p.m. We have a lot of ground to cover. So I'm just going to go right into it. My name is Jasmine Ramsey. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for Human Rights in Iran. We were founded in 2008 by our Executive Director, Hadi Qaimi. Our mission really boils down to three facets. The first one being to amplify voices of people inside Iran, to amplify their demands, their stories, their cases, through the networks that we've built throughout these years. And the second is to advocate policies that put the fundamental rights of the people of Iran at the center of foreign policies of international governments and international institutions to pressure Iranian officials to stop committing rights abuses. And the third one is really to document. And the best example of that is something that you can see on our website right now, www.iranhumanrights.org, where we have put a major report. It's meticulous documentation of major rights violations that happened, really actually mass atrocities that can amount to crimes against humanity in the city of Javan Rud in Iran around this time last year against peaceful protesters who were simply raising their voices against the state, against repressive policies. And so that's really what we do is in a country like Iran with vibrant culture, beautiful history, beautiful people, we shine a spotlight on what's happening within the government's abuses against the people, and bring that to international forums, including the independent fact-finding mission on Iran, to ultimately hold Iranian officials accountable. Now, I am going to just tell you about the format of our event. We have 3 Iranian human rights lawyers with us today, and they really need no introduction. Their bios are in the invite that you received, also on our website. And we will be opening the floor to questions that you can ask at any time during the event. There is a Q&A option, and it's really the Q&A that I want you to see at the bottom panel of your Zoom. You can write a question in there at any time. It will only be seen by the panelists and the organizers. And once all 3 are done speaking, I will start asking questions based on what you've all written there of our participants. And I ask that please keep your questions brief. We have a lot of ground to cover. Now, I'm going to go into our first panelist. Her name is Elham Youssefian. Elham, I'm going to ask you to turn on your video and unmute yourself. She is an Iranian human rights lawyer specializing in the rights of persons with disabilities and the human rights of women, including combating gender-based violence. Elham did this as a practicing lawyer inside Iran. And today she continues to advocate international standards of human rights. I wanted Elham to speak about something very important because in the wake of the Woman Life Freedom movement, so many women, countless women across Iran have been removing their hijabs and their headscarves in peaceful defiance of the state's forced hijab law. The Iranian government has responded by trying to push through legislation to further impose punishments on Iranian women for choosing to be unveiled. So Elham's going to talk a little bit to us about that legislation. Please take the floor, Elham. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be part of this important panel on this important and historic day. So I will focus on the new bill that Iranian parliament recently adopted and is estimated to become an enforceable law very soon, which is to force hijab and chastity on women, what is described as hijab and chastity bill. When you look at this law, you realize like 2 main realities. First one is how widespread and systematic the level of discrimination and oppression that this law is trying to force on women and girls, and also on men who are supporting them. On the other side, of course, this law, in my opinion, shows how desperate the government of Iran is. When you look into this law and look at like different measures, and like basically this law has a few features that when I explain to them, you're gonna find out why I say that this law on one side is so systematically discriminatory, limiting women's rights in many different levels, and on the other side indicates how desperate the government in Iran is. The first thing is that the law is basically defining obligations for every single part of the government. All ministries, even like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is mandated, for example, to spread this culture of hijab and chastity by contracting with stakeholders, interested governments, and non-governmental organizations around the world. So it introduces like obligations for every single part of the government. The second thing is that it's adding general people, like public, like ordinary people, to the law enforcement, which is very dangerous. Basically, according to this law, individuals, after some sort of training by the police, can act to report a violation of this hijab and chastity. So they can like put pictures, report pictures of women who, in their opinion, are violating this law to the authorities, which is very dangerous. The other feature of this law is to spread the penalties that are being imposed on women that do not require even the, we all are aware how flawed the Iranian justice system is. But even that flawed justice system is not going to be available for many of these cases. For many of these crimes that have been defined by this law, the police itself can just prosecute people and impose penalties on them. Another feature of this law, which I want to highlight, is how it emphasizes and actually targets the vulnerability of Iranian people these days, which is economic challenges. So every single article of this law has like financial penalties on people. Like, for example, estimating the interest that a business violating the law has been gaining. They force them to pay, for example, 2 or 4 months of the monthly interest or a financial bill, whichever is the higher amount. So basically, and also the closing the businesses, closing the restaurants, like even the cars, like public transportation, private transportation, or similar services. Like, for example, we have here in the US, we have Uber, we have Lyft, the similar services in Iran. If somebody doesn't fulfill with these laws in the car when they're getting a ride, they can force them not penalties to them. So this is how the government of Iran is recognizing this economic vulnerability of people and actually targeting that. So people are going to be deprived of their source of income or will have to pay a big amount of financial penalties for just somebody not wearing like a headscarf. And even in this regard, they are collaborating with the tax office in Iran, with all the banks, and they are introducing a system of chasing citizens and grabbing the money. And this is also, in my opinion, a way of Iranian government to address its own economic challenges, like fulfilling daily requirements of the government. So this is another feature that I wanted to highlight in this law. The law is creating a situation, if they manage to enforce it, which in my opinion, they will not be able to do so, it will create possibility of violating women's right to employment, to education, to access cultural events, even to possibly like access food, to access public transportation and freedom of movement, to family life, to privacy, to even being safe from violence and abuse, because basically when it gives the authority to ordinary citizens to act as law enforcement officials, that puts women women at higher risk of violence and abuse. So, for example, even the law recognizes that, like in schools or universities, students who do not fulfill the hijab requirements may be subject to disciplinary measures, which is like a big risk of deprivation of education. And also, we are all aware of the culture of some families being like so restrictive on women and girls. And, being subject to this type of punishment may put some women and girls at higher risk of gender-based violence. So all in all, and I want to keep it short, and we will also hear from Gissou about gender apartheid. This law is creating a systematic mechanism for oppressing women and restricting various rights at different levels. However, at the same time, as I mentioned in the beginning, I think this also shows how the government of Iran is desperate. When you look at the law, you see there have been many punishments introduced for government authorities who fail to fulfill the obligations that this law has created for them. Even, for example, there is an article mentioning that if those who are violating the hijab law are family members of authorities, their wives or children, the punishment's going to be higher. This shows that this is really happening. This shows that even the family members of authorities are not fulfilling the hijab law. Also, there is a punishment introduced for the law enforcement, for the police who do not enforce this law. This again shows that this is happening, that some of the police are not forcing women to wear hijab. And they are trying to, by introducing punishment, force them to do so. I mean, in Persian, we have an idiom. We say, when you pick up a big stone, it means you are not going to be able to hit the target. And in my opinion, this law is an example of that, because they are introducing so many measures and creating so many obligations that, in my opinion, number one, shows how widespread the fact that women are refusing to wear hijab is. And secondly, how desperate the Islamic Republic is, because they're realizing that it's getting out of their control and it's part of their cultural identity. They're trying with as many efforts, as many measures that they can to bring this back into control, but I don't think they will manage to. Happy to continue the conversation. Back to you.
Thank you, Elham. That's truly fascinating what you're talking about that it's really unable to hit the target. Now I want to ask Gissou Nia to please turn on her microphone and her video. Gissou is a human rights lawyer and the founder and director of the Strategic Litigation Project at the Atlantic Council. Since the murder of Mahsa Jina Amini in September 2022, she has led efforts to hold the Islamic Republic accountable, including the successful campaign to remove it from the UN Commission on the Status of Women. And Gissou is also co-founder of the ongoing campaign to codify gender apartheid as a crime under international law. And so I am just going to, one moment, find Gissou here. Hold on a second. Apologies, Gissou. You should be able to speak there. So please, Gissou, if you could talk about your campaign and also challenges to Iran's women life freedom movement on the international stage.
Great. Jasmine, thank you so much for having me into the Center for Human Rights in Iran, for putting on this timely event and looking at the legal issues that we're dealing with over this past year. So the campaign to codify the crime of gender apartheid really came about because there has been intense global scrutiny of the Islamic Republic of Iran's gender discriminatory laws. Now, to many of us who are from Iran or who have worked on human rights issues and justice issues in the country, that gender discriminatory framework will not be a surprise to anybody. But I think that on the world stage, although there may have been some awareness of the fact that women in Iran are dealt with in a way that involves subjugation and suppression, I think there probably wasn't the sort of keen understanding that that's not necessarily just a societal thing, as you would see across the world. Many different countries deal with issues of misogyny and patriarchy, and that's a global problem. But the thing that's really distinct about the Islamic Republic of Iran is that they've actually enshrined that gender discrimination in their laws, and it's very extreme. And I think the killing of Mahsa Amini really brought that to the surface, because she ostensibly, reached this horrible death in custody just for maybe showing a few strands of hair. So I think that sort of awareness has amplified since the Women Life Freedom movement, since people around the world kind of asking why it is that women are in these public demonstrations, cutting their hair, taking off their mandatory hijab, like what is animating this? And it's really this gender discriminatory legal framework. And so there were a number of actions that myself and others who maybe can, assist, who are outside of Iran and can maybe, work with different international institutions in a way more freely, because we can travel to Geneva, New York, different country capitals, sort of engage, governmental decision makers without fear of being jailed for those activities, as our human rights lawyer counterparts in the country in Iran are being threatened and are jailed for their legal representation and their work. There were a number of campaigns that were very focused on these women's rights issues. One of those was to remove the Islamic Republic of Iran from the UN Commission on the Status of Women, which is a UN body that builds itself as the sort of top global body dealing with women's issues and empowerment around the world. That was a successful campaign, and the Islamic Republic was voted off by member states in December of last year. And at the time, after that happened, it was very interesting because I was receiving a lot of messages from Afghan women's activists, and our Afghan sisters really saying, well done, we're proud of you, this was such a good job. And, it really struck me that, Afghanistan was still on the UN Commission on the Status of Women. And although it's not the Taliban represented Afghanistan, it's the holdover from the prior government, it's still really quite significant that country, which, has been, obviously has a very severe form of gender discrimination, and there's a decree practically every other day from the Taliban announcing a new restriction on women's rights and autonomy. It was really significant for me that they were still there. And I think there's been a desire from Iranian women activists to sort of unite around these shared struggles with Afghan women who are dealing with a very similar type of brutality, but just perhaps, a bit amplified there and a bit more extreme in Afghanistan. And so one thing that became clear is that a lot of Iranian and Afghan frontline defenders have been using the term gender apartheid to describe the situation that they are living under, with Iranian women living under the Islamic Republic and Afghan women living under the Taliban. And when I spoke to some of these, frontline defenders, they didn't realize that gender apartheid is not actually criminalized under international law. Apartheid applies to racial apartheid. And that's really an experience born out of South Africa, of course, and the sort of white-led apartheid regime in South Africa that was dismantled from 1990 to 1994, but went on for decades. And so we have a crime of apartheid under international law that sits apart from South Africa. It's not only specific to South Africa. There is an apartheid convention that was passed in 1973. And then apartheid has also been included as a crimes against humanity in the Rome Statute, which is the document that animates the International Criminal Court and gives its authority. But it only applies to race. And so essentially, although we have, and apartheid is basically a system in which there is one group, currently as defined, one racial group dominating another racial group, and is really for purposes of entrenching power and domination. And when you swap out race for gender in that definition, it very much applies to the situation of women and girls living in Afghanistan for certain, and also living in Iran today. And so essentially the campaign is seeking to codify this. So to expand the current definition of apartheid under international law and under national laws in different countries to include gender. Now, just quickly go through some of how this campaign came about. You can also visit the website and learn more there, and what the next steps are for the campaign. We launched the campaign on March 8th, International Women's Day. There's a website, endgenderapartheid.today. So there you can read the open letter that was drafted by a bunch of prominent Iranian and Afghan women's rights activists, former judges, lawyers, and also some international lawyers in solidarity with us. And there's about 100 key signatories, and they're demanding that governments around the world amplify and raise awareness about the situation of gender apartheid. And they're also asking them to codify this crime. So what do we mean by that? Well, there's a few ways you could go about it. You could change the definition in the Apartheid Convention to include gender. You could amend the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court to include gender. But what we think might be the most promising way forward, and what we are working on currently, is including gender apartheid as a crimes against humanity in the Global Crimes Against Humanity Convention that's currently being negotiated globally. And so what is that? Well, for those in the audience who are familiar with the different types of atrocity crimes, we have a genocide convention that a lot of states have signed on to. We have a convention against torture that a lot of states have signed on to. War crimes also have a standard global regime governing it because we have the Geneva Convention. So a lot of the most severe crimes have a treaty or a convention that different states around the world have agreed to. What we don't have is a crimes against humanity convention. We don't have it yet. And basically, crimes against humanity are criminalized under the ICC Rome Statute. But as we know, there's a lot of countries that are not signed on as member states to the International Criminal Court, Iran being one of them, the US being one of them, Russia, China, so there's a bunch of countries that are not signed on. But what we hope is that there will be a Crimes Against Humanity Convention that will be adopted by the 6th Committee at the UN, which is the legal committee at the UN. And that's currently being negotiated. There's a draft Crimes Against Humanity Convention. What we'd like to do is ensure that the crime of apartheid in that convention is actually expanded to include gender. There is a brief that is being drafted right now, and that will be circulated soon to legal advisors at UN missions concerning the arguments for why we need this crime. And I think the rationale is pretty clear, because there are some situations around the world that are so severe, so extreme, that gender persecution, although that's an existing crime and a crime against humanity, this doesn't quite capture the unique experience of Iranian and Afghan women living under these discriminatory regimes. So that's what we're moving forward. And one thing I'll note about who is supporting is, of course, we have the frontline defenders who are supporting this effort, but we're quite honored to see that anti-apartheid activists who were key in dismantling the apartheid regime in South Africa have actually come to support this effort. Gracia Machel, who is the widow of Nelson Mandela and a women's rights campaigner, known women's rights campaigner in her own right, signed on to our open letter a few months ago, giving us the sort of like moral weight and clarity, and gave an interview to The Telegraph saying that gender apartheid should be codified under international law. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Afghanistan announced on June 19th in a report that he believes that this crime should be codified under international law. And on September 1st, a group of UN experts and working group experts, including the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran, said that the new bill about hijab that Elham was just speaking about, that could possibly constitute gender apartheid. And so really apartheid is about living apart. It's about the segregation and subjugation of a group of people for purposes of entrenching a regime. And that is really what we see in the Islamic Republic today. I'll pause there, but look forward to Q&A.
Thank you very much, Gissou. Honestly, it's amazing to hear about this moving towards the international stage, and that Iranian women and Afghan women are at the forefront of this. So now we're going to take it back domestically to Iran. And so this event is with Iranian human rights lawyers, and we have today speaking with us Saeid Dehghan, who until recently was inside Iran working on high-profile human rights cases within the Iranian court system. And he's represented individuals in high-profile cases, including dual nationals that have been held as hostages by the state. He holds active memberships in both the Iranian Bar Association and the International Bar Association. And he's really not only a human rights lawyer, he's an educator and an author. Saeid, I'm going to ask you to please unmute yourself and turn on your video, and I'm going to hand the floor to you. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely, we can.
Yeah, I would like to thank my distinguished co-panelists and all of you here for joining us today at this important and critical time for Iran. To understand why human rights lawyers in Iran are constantly facing obstacles and even being prosecuted themselves by the Islamic Republic's judiciary, we should ask who are their clients and who are they trying to defend. The defendants are Iranian dissident, young people and women in particular, and opponents of the regime in general. The key issue here is also the fact that the Islamic Republic's judiciary has put in place a system that allows only lawyers who are pre-approved by the judiciary to represent such cases of dissident. It has imposed its will on the society within a law known as the Amendment to Article 48 of the Criminal Procedures. This is similar to other repressive measures imposed on the society, such as hijab and other laws violating basic freedoms that interfere in the private lives of citizens. In order to expand and analyze this problem, I would like to open by looking at a tangible and a familiar case, a case that ignited the woman life freedom movement in Iran last year. Let's start by stating the problem. One, a young woman named Gina Mahsa Amini travels from her hometown of Saqqez to Tehran to visit relatives during her summer vacation. Although she is observing the hijab and wearing a headscarf, but because not all of her hair is covered, she is detained by the so-called morality police. She loses her life because of the circumstances of her detention and how she is treated during the few hours in custody. Two, Iranian citizens, especially women and young people, come to protest in solidarity and gather in front of the CHRI hospital in Tehran, where Mahsa loses her life. These protesting citizens are themselves arrested. Three, two journalists, Niloufar Hamidi and Elham Mohammadi, who covered these events and published reports about it. They themselves are arrested and subsequently charged with national security crimes such as cooperation with enemy government and are still being held in prison as of today. 4. A group of medical doctors in Iran, after reviewing the available medical records and reports, reached the conclusion that the cause of Mahsa's death is multiple blows to the head and her death was not natural death. These medical doctors also get persecuted under national security crimes and charged with propaganda against the state. 5. A group of human rights lawyers who are persecuting the cases of detainees, including detained protesters, journalists who reported on it, and doctors who investigated it. They themselves, the lawyers who want to provide legal representation to detainees, they are also detained. 6. Eventually, lawyers and colleagues who act to represent the detained human rights lawyer, they are also detained. Now, let's analyze the problem. 1. Let's assume that the Islamic Republic has the right to institute laws under the guise of religion or national security that violate the citizens' civil rights. Of course, Article 9 of the Constitution forbids the passing of such laws, but let's say they can act as such. For example, in case of hijab violation, the unacceptable article of laws provides for a punishment of maximum 2 months. This law is amended to provide for conversion of the prison sentence to financial fine. Therefore, further detention, torture during detention, and other ill treatments of those persecuted under this law should be illegal. 2. Also, let's make note of the following. A. According to existing laws, Iranian citizens have the right to peacefully protest. This right is enshrined in Article 227 of the Constitution. B. The mandate and professional role of journalists is to investigate, gather, and publish news. C. Medical doctors, according to their professional oath, must be concerned about public health and safety. Considering all of the above, therefore none have broken any laws, and their arrest and persecutions itself is illegal. 3. Let's even assume that arrest and detention of those citizens who oppose the Islamic Republic is a legal act. Yet, according to Article 35 of the Constitution, these detainees must have access to a lawyer of their choosing in all stages of interrogation and persecution. Also, Article 38 of the Constitution states that any torture for obtaining coerced confessions is illegal and should be prosecuted. As a footnote, note that Article 48 of the Criminal Procedures denying access to a lawyer of one's choosing for dissidents is in direct contradiction to Article 35 of the Constitution I just mentioned. 4. And let's make the impossible assumption that dissidents and political opponents can be persecuted under the Islamic Republic's law. But according to these same laws, they should be persecuted in a public court and in a presence of a jury. That is according to Article 168 of the Constitution. Yet they are prosecuted behind closed doors in revolutionary courts with no access to legal counsel and without a jury. 5. Given these circumstances, and even assuming the revolutionary court to have a legal standing to prosecute dissidents, which they absolutely do not, yet according to Article 450 of the Criminal Procedure Code, lawyers who challenge the lower court's decision must be able to attend appeals court hearing and explain their objections. None of this happened because the head of the judiciary writes a bureaucratic letter to the supreme leader and obtains his permission to violate this law, not to hold public hearings and literally transform the appeals court hearing to a rubber stamping hearing. 6. When the cases of dissidents and political prisoners reach its final stage in the Supreme Court, what happens is a rush to confirm unfair and unlawful sentences, such as execution. These sentences are carried out in a rush and without allowing defense lawyers to appeal them under the timetable written into the law. There are many such cases. Just during the Women Life Freedom Movement, the execution of several young protesters, young people, Majid Reza Rahnavard, Mohammad Hosseini, Mehdi Karami, as well the cases of those sentenced to execution in Isfahan followed this illegal and rushed pattern in confirming and carrying out this inhumane punishment, which is irreversible. And now, here my concluding remark. This situation, reflecting the reality in Iran, shows that, 1, the judicial and legal system in Iran has collapsed, and there is no observance of even the existing laws in practice and the courtrooms. This I have called judicial collapse, or in the Farsi, furupashi huquqi. 2, accountability and seeking justice is not possible in such a totalitarian political system, even as Article 34 of the Constitution states that seeking justice and redress is the fundamental right of every Iranian citizen. But we see the families of those killed, families seeking justice for loss of their loved ones. They themselves are detained, prosecuted, and punished. And finally, here are some recommendations. Given the current circumstance where seeking justice under the Islamic Republic is impossible, perhaps the only venue for seeking justice and accountability is in the international arena. Therefore, my recommendations to you is: 1, hear their voice, be their voice, and raise their voice in international forums. 2, collect and submit the evidence of crimes committed to the UN fact-finding mission. 3, pursue the perpetrators of these crimes under the universal jurisdiction principle. 4, we should all work and develop transitional justice mechanisms. 5, we should advocate for and lay the grounds for a future Iran joining the International Criminal Court ICC. 6. And last but not least, Iranian activists and organizations should work on a roadmap to democracy. I myself engaged in several such initiatives, such as the Gozar Network that was launched in Stanford University a few months ago, as well as on behalf of my legal entity, Parsi Law, where we are developing these documents with cooperation of a group of Iranian lawyers inside the country. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Saeid. So for everyone that's just joined, if you have questions, please write them in the Q&A option that you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom panel. We got a few, and so we'll be asking these questions before we wrap up. I'm going to just start with you, Saeid. A question that has come in is that given that not only are citizens arrested and imprisoned for speaking out, but so are their lawyers, and given the challenges that you faced while you were working as an independent lawyer inside Iran, why do you and your colleagues continue to try to provide due process and advance these rights, even though, as you said, in the judicial system, it seems almost impossible?
The short answer to your question is because we lawyers, alongside the general public, do not have any other option but to resist and struggle. Taking on human rights cases in Iran is like walking in a minefield without a map. As in the stream and the stone, a Persian story that's taught to school children, lawyers must learn how to find their way between rocks and stones. Yet every year there is less water in the stream and the rocks are bigger and sharper. This is a point I made in an article that the campaign published 3 years ago. I'm still of the same opinion, and as such we are of the people and for the people, and therefore stand next to them and the activists in their struggles.
Thank you, Saeid. Elham, we have a question for you, so I'm going to ask you to turn on your video and unmute yourself. They said thank you for the presentation, and someone's asking you to expand on the measures that the chastity law proposes for officials and their family members. Thank you.
So basically the first chapters of the legislation, ministry by ministry, counts all the ministers, creates obligations for them. What should they do to enforce this law? And so, for example, we have like a specific chapter for the Ministry of Trade and Industry, like how they need to invest on producing so-called Islamic clothing, and also limitations on importing what is perceived as non-Islamic or against family values clothing. Then we have like specific articles talking about obligations for the Ministry of Transportation. So recently we have received like reports from inside Iran how people are noticing cameras installed even in subway cars everywhere. And this is actually anticipated in this legislation, mandating the Ministry of Transportation to make sure that all public transportation vehicles are equipped with cameras so they can document what's going there. So it's like a massive surveillance against citizens. What I mentioned about authorities, so the law mentions that any public authority who fails to fulfill these obligations will be punished by imprisonment or financial penalties, as well as like losing their authority, losing their job. Basically, this law very much maneuvers around, as I mentioned, depriving people from the job, the source of income that they have, or promoting in their jobs. Also for the family members, there is an article, as I mentioned, that if the perpetrator of violating hijab and chastity is wife, children, or family members of authorities, there would be no possibility of getting any support or discounts in the punishment. So that just shows that they are more strict on authorities' family members. I hope I answered the question. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question for Gissou. What challenges or obstacles, Gissou, do you anticipate in garnering international support and cooperation to address gender apartheid, and how can these challenges be overcome?
So, well, there is a lot of potential resistance for different reasons. So one thing I would say is that there may be some countries around the world that have their own spotty records when it comes to gender discrimination that will perhaps think that this crime could also apply to them. But what we need to emphasize is that this is really very extreme. It needs to be a system where discrimination against women is not something that's simply tolerated as part of society, but it has to really be where this is actually part of the law, and it's designed to separate women and treat them in a different way and subjugate them for purposes of power. So it's a very specific intent that's required here. So I don't think, if countries spend a bit more time with the definition and realize what it's applying to and see how it applies to specific case studies like Afghanistan or Iran, they probably won't see themselves in that. But that's one thing that we were thinking about. The other simply is just like the onerous process of amending laws. So some of these international conventions already took a lot of effort to bring into being, and the amendment process is not so straightforward. And so that's why we're actually keen to get this inserted into the Crimes Against Humanity Convention, because that's not a law yet. And it's much easier to get something into a law that doesn't exist as opposed to amending a current treaty or convention. The other thing is just cultural relativism. Unfortunately, there's still many governmental actors around the world who dismiss the discriminatory treatment of women in these countries as something that's just cultural. You would think that we would have abandoned this way of thinking, but it's not necessarily the case. And I've been surprised, even at the time of when we were leading the campaign to remove the Islamic Republic from the UN Commission on the Status of Women, that some diplomats from Europe as well were hesitant to do that. They thought that, engagement with the Islamic Republic was preferable. And that implies an assumption that the Islamic Republic is interested in reforming, which I think by this point, we've sort of seen that that's not the case, and that they actually do need to be held accountable for a discriminatory system that they relish in and are proud of. So I think sort of pushing back on those viewpoints is what's going to be most important. And also some people ask the question of like, what is the utility of this? What is the use? Like, what is that actually going to do for women on the ground? And I think the answer to that is just that the women on the ground are the ones who are asking for their specific circumstances to be recognized in this way under the law, and for their experiences to be reflected in that. And they believe that it's very important for not normalizing these regimes and not normalizing their conduct. There are so many sanctions and different policy tools that are aimed at the Islamic Republic's purported ballistic missiles activity, terrorism activity, their nuclear proliferation. But is there really a spotlight on what are the concrete foreign policy actions that are going to be taken for this extreme form of discrimination against women? I don't think we see that reflected enough. And I think that's probably because human rights are often not considered to be part of hard security issues, which I really disagree with. And so part of moving this forward is really to change that conversation as well. It's not only about a protection gap or a need for accountability. It's also about trying to frame what, how governments around the world view the Islamic Republic and view the Taliban, which are completely unacceptable actors for their treatment of more than half the population and what they're doing to their women.
And Gissou, before you mute, just for people that want to help raise awareness and build momentum for helping to recognize and address gender apartheid, what can just average people do, especially around this time ahead of the anniversary of September 16th?
There's a lot. So definitely visit the site, which I see, Jasmine, I think you linked in the comments if folks can see that. But endgenderapartheid.today, go and sign the open letter. So your name and voice matters, especially when we go into meetings with governmental decision makers. When they see the numbers of people that are asking for the same thing, it really makes a difference. So definitely sign and share that open letter, get your networks to sign it, post about it. We're going to launch some social media channels this week for the campaign. We hadn't up to this point simply because we were just basically having all the signatories sort of push the information about it, but there's been a real demand for us to have concrete social media channels. So you'll be able to share that content and educate people about what gender apartheid is. One thing that I noticed is that people roughly around under the age of 35 sometimes don't know what apartheid is. And they don't know what apartheid is because they weren't really alive or watching the news when South Africa had its system of apartheid. So unless you study transitional justice and systems like that, you might not even be aware of what the crime of apartheid is, which is really different to, for example, genocide, which, as many know, the origin story, at least of how that law was created, was really in connection to the Holocaust. But it doesn't only apply to the Holocaust. It applies to multiple other situations where, unfortunately, a population, there's an aim to destroy in part or whole a population. Really here, there hasn't been maybe as much global education around the horrors of apartheid era South Africa. And so we hope this can also be an educational tool and to see the parallels between these struggles.
Thank you, Gissou. Last question we have is for Elham, and after that, I think we'll just wrap up. Elham, someone is asking, is the bill applicable to both men and women? And if yes, what are the discriminatory provisions? And I guess it would be useful to just talk about what men are expected to do and what women are expected to do, the difference between those.
Yeah, of course it is applicable to men because, for example, if you are a business owner and this so-called crimes happen in your business, you will be subject to those punishments. If you're driving a car and a woman is sitting in that car, you will be punished for that. If you are running a tour, like basically what I was noticing is that this law even addresses like touristic activities, like people traveling and stuff like that. Like if you're leading a tour, for example, and someone doesn't wear headscarf in your tour, you will be punished for that. You may lose your permission to run the tour. If you are your family members violate these laws, you may face that. If you are having a responsibility in a university, in a school, in a government entity, or in a non-government entity like a public business, as I mentioned, anything happening within your scope of work, you have to control, you have to report, you have to force them to comply with the mandatory hijab. So this is like being responsible on one side. And also there's one more thing that I want to highlight. This law has a specific article talking about what they call nudity, or being like half nude, or something like that, that actually even describes a dress code for men, that they cannot show above their knees or like shoulders. So and also be like above the below the chest. So basically, it's also creating some sort of limitations for dress code for men, and that may sound funny because we always have learned that hijab is only for women. But right now, I mean, at some point we realized that some young men in Iran joined the movement by wearing shorts in the street, and then they were also now subject to this law. So these are some of the ways that law impacts men. And of course, if they don't stand alongside women and try to combat this law, I think the limitations on men going to increase as well.
Thank you. So I'm just going to ask everyone to just turn on their video, and I'm going to wrap up. I want to say, so remember to visit Gissou's website, endgenderapartheid.today. Also, please, let me just turn on gallery view so you can see us all in the same room for a moment. Also visit our website. For those who joined late, we have a major report. Please do check that out. Firsthand testimony, video and photo evidence of mass atrocities in Javanrud. September 16th is 4 days away. There will be protests across the world, I think, in solidarity with the people inside Iran. Please check out your local activist chapters to join those protests. Elham Youssefian, Gissou Nia, Saeid Dehghan, thank you so much for the work that you do and for your remarks today. Everyone, we will be releasing a recording of this event, and so you will receive an email with that. And with that, I want to say solidarity with the Women, Life, Freedom movement of Iran, and thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.